History 104. Today's lecture is a bit of an introduction to some of the things we're going to be talking about this semester and a few terms and key concepts that I would like for you to know as we go through the course. Today's topic is the way that early Christianity came into the Roman Empire, starting in the 1st century CE and ending in the 5th century CE. So let's talk a little bit about those terms, CE and BCE, and BC and AD. The traditional way in the Western world of counting dates is to date the first year of the modern era around the traditional number of the birth of Jesus. So starting in 1 AD, the year that Jesus was born. And when you use that system, you use BC, which means before Christ, and you use AD, which is Anno Domini, or in the year of our Lord. Now, because that is such a heavily religiously connotated way of expressing dates, historians who work on other countries and religious systems in the world have switched to using BCE, which means before the Common Era, and CE, the Common Era. That's what I'm going to do my best to use this semester, though I sometimes slip. The two are equivalent. So something that is BC is also BCE, and something that is AD is also CE. Now, the other thing that I talk about a lot is what century something is in. So this is a little confusing, but if you've never done it before, I think I can explain it. The year 1 through the year 99 would be the 1st century CE, because that is the century that starts in the year 1 AD, or 1 CE. So what that practically means is that when you figure out what century something is in, you subtract 1 from the first two numbers of the year. So if you want the 13th century, right, subtract 1 from 13 and you get 12. So it's the 1200s are the 13th century, the 1300s are the 14th century, the 600s are the 7th century, etc. If that's confusing and you want to ask me about it, please do. The other thing I want to talk about very briefly is the way that historians divide up European history in order to make sense of what is a very large and long time period. You can see two time periods here that are concentrated on the Romans, the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is supposed to have begun at the death of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE and to have ended in 476 CE, which is the date of the deposition of the last Roman emperor in the West. We're going to be spending most of our time in the period between 500 and 1450. So we'll be looking at the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and the first part of the Renaissance. And just for the sake of completeness, the early modern period starts with Martin Luther and the Reformation and goes to 1789. And the modern era starts with 1789. That's the beginning of the French Revolution. Now, there are some people who say that we're no longer living in the modern era, but that we're living in some sort of postmodern era. I don't have an opinion on that, but it's sometimes interesting to think about. Now take a look at this map of Rome in the 100s, that is the 2nd century CE. And you might notice a couple of things about it. First of all, that it is very, very large. It covers thousands of miles of territory. And it is populated with lots and lots of little cities and a couple of really major cities. You can see them, they're the red circles on the map. And working in an empire, trying to make an empire of this size work in the ancient world was a huge challenge. As you can imagine, there are many problems that are associated with having an empire this large. Empires that are this large usually spend a lot of their time trying to fight to expand their borders, because that's one of the ways that they make money. But communication between the edges of the empire and the middle was, of course, a very long-term affair. You had to go a very long way to communicate between, say, Antioch and Rome. The other thing that I want you to notice is this border. This border right here. As you can see, that is a very, very long border. And it provided the Romans with a lot of problems in the period that we're talking about. There we go. So let's talk a bit about early Christianity. The person that we know as Jesus was probably born between 6 BCE and 4 BCE, and that has to do with some of the internal evidence in the Bible and in a historian called Josephus, and also having to do with the periods in which the heavens might have shown a large bright star. So there are lots of controversies, of course, about exactly when Jesus was born, but we'll stick with the 6 BCE for now. He is thought to have died, and for his followers, he is thought to have been resurrected in 33 CE in the Roman province of Judea. Now, Judea was a protectorate of the Roman Empire, and as you may already be aware, the ruler of Judea was a Roman official whose name was Pontius Pilate. Now, as Jesus was doing his preaching, his reach was not that far. He was in an area in Judea which was pretty remote. But his follower, Paul of Tarsus, who was born in about 5 CE and died in about 67, made the ideas and religious views that were preached by Jesus into something that the Roman Republic and Empire could accept. One of the things that Paul did to help Romans become Christians was to remove the requirement to become a Jew before you could become Christian. So, for example, some early Christians argued that Christianity was a form of Judaism, and so you had to go through a conversion process into Judaism before you could become a Christian. Paul denied that. He removed Judaism from the equation, so anyone who was able to convert inside the Roman Empire was allowed to convert. So he's preaching that this religion is applicable to all people rather than simply to the Jewish community. If you know the New Testament, which some of you may, a lot of what we know about Paul comes from the letters he wrote to various churches inside the Roman Republic in the 1st century CE, before he was killed in the Christian persecutions of 67 CE. All right, now religion in the Roman Empire was a strange and wonderful thing. You may already be familiar with some of the gods and goddesses in the Roman pantheon. In the early Roman Empire, religion was a very powerful tool of the state to keep particularly the upper classes in line. If you were a member of a religion that was not the Roman state religion, you risked sometimes arrest and sometimes persecution for your faith. The reason for this was that the Romans required every citizen to participate in the state religion. There were a couple of reasons why they thought that. One was that they believed that if everyone inside a particular society did not do their religious duty, then their gods would retaliate against them by sending terrible things like plagues and storms. So there was a law passed in 6 CE which forbade the worship of certain groups of religions that the Romans called the mystery cults. Now, cult here is a word that religious scholars use to refer to the group of people who worship a particular deity. It's not a cult like a Charles Manson cult. It's not a bad word. It's simply a word that describes what goes on in a religion. Christianity and Judaism fell under this law against non-Roman faiths. And then there are a couple of others that I'm going to talk about really quickly that are kind of interesting, and to tell us a little bit about what the religious community was like in the 1st century AD. What you're looking over at in the picture here is a Roman statue, Greco-Roman statue of the goddess Isis. The cult of Isis was a form of worship for women that came up from Egypt. We don't know a tremendous amount about the cult of Isis, but the fact that it was for women and that it was almost certainly a kind of fertility cult gives us an idea of what might have been going on there. Now, part of the reason why these types of religion are so controversial in the Roman Empire is that in the early empire, it was believed that the emperor was a god. This starts with an emperor who was called Augustus. After he died, which is in 14 AD, the Roman Senate declared him a member of the Roman pantheon. So he became a god, and that's what the word deify means, deification. Now, later on, much weaker and less creative emperors like Caligula claimed to be gods while they were still alive. And the weaker and less effective the emperor, the more likely he was to lean on his godhood. So you can think about for just a second what this is going to mean for early Christians. This is a picture of a bull sacrifice from the religion that's called the cult of Mithras. Mithras is a sky god who comes from Persia. Very little is known about the exact ideas of this religion, but it was a religion that was meant for upper class men. And one of its major religious rituals was the slaughter of a perfect white bull. So it was quite expensive to be a member if you had to provide a white bull. So when you see Mithras in art, he's almost always about to cut the throat of the sacrificial bull, and his cloak is usually billowing out behind him because he's the sky god. His cloak makes up the sky. Here he is in a mosaic. Sorry, that one's not as clear as I would like. Okay. So what was it that made the Romans object so strongly to early Christianity? Well, remember, you have to make sacrifice to the emperor and belong to the Roman state religion in order to be tolerated by the Roman political system. And the first commandment, which Christians get from Judaism, "You shall have no other gods before me," which means basically that Christians are not allowed to worship anybody else except their own God. So from the very beginning, their refusal to sacrifice to the emperor's godhood made them already on the other side of the law. Because Christianity was illegal at this point, the religious services went underground. So what we think an early Christian religious service would have looked like is that a bunch of people would get together. They would eat the sacrificial meal, which is described in the Gospel of John, eating some bread and drinking some wine. They would read some biblical text, probably the letters of Paul, which are the earliest parts of the Bible to be, the New Testament to be written down. And then they would talk a lot about being brothers and sisters. Well, because this religion was underground at this point, the Romans came up with some explanations for what they were doing that were extremely strange and led to the persecution of many, many Christians. They had heard that Christians worshipped a male baby, right? The Christmas story had made its way via word of mouth to the Roman authorities. But then there was also all this talk about sharing the bread and wine, which was really the flesh and blood of this male baby. So the Romans began to accuse the Christians of cannibalism. The idea being that during Christian religious services, a baby was slaughtered, which was then eaten by the worshippers. And then, of course, everyone would get together and have an orgy, because you can't really have a non-tolerated religion in which sex is not involved in some way. So Christians were not only bad citizens, but they were baby killers and sexual degenerates. So you can imagine that that went over very poorly with the Roman Republic, with the Roman imperial groups, and also with the common people in Rome. So major persecutions begin starting in the 60s CE and continuing all the way through the 200s. The last major persecution is in 285. Now, the way that this played out in the Christian community was that the people who refused to sacrifice to the emperor and were executed became what they referred to as martyrs. Martyr is a Greek word which means a person who dies for the faith. Now, we have a document that we're going to discuss in class that I would like you to read, which is the Passion of St. Perpetua and Felicity. It's there on Moodle. It's about 5 pages. And you will find for every document that we read for class, except for the really long ones, I have made an audio recording of that source so that if you would like, you can listen to it. And probably the very best thing that you can do is to listen to the recording while reading along on the document. That way you will be able to understand the document particularly well, I think. Now, these are the questions that we're going to ask of each document that we discuss this semester. Okay? The theory being that every document is like a beer commercial. So you are from a generation that has been advertised to more than any other generation in history. You know what an ad is like, you know what it's designed to make you do. And I'd like for you to think of every document that we read this semester as though it were a beer commercial. We know that every beer commercial attempts to sell you beer. So we have to figure out what it is that every document is trying to sell us. So the first thing I'd like for you to look at is who is doing the selling or writing. In the case of St. Perpetua, it's Perpetua herself and also someone else. What are they selling? Now, this is both simple and complicated depending on the document. A document can sell several different things depending on the audience. So we want to think about audience when we think about what they're selling. How are they selling it? Are they selling it with reason? Are they selling it with emotion? Often I will ask when we talk about this, what is the tone of a document? Is it angry? Is it fearful? Is it calm? Is it reasonable, etc.? Then we have to talk audience. To whom are they selling? We know that beer commercials are selling beer to people who want to drink beer. It's a little bit more complicated when it comes to a particular source. Whether or not you think that the people that were being sold to bought the ideas that were in the document. Do you think that it was effective in the way that it sold information to the people of its time? And then last is a little bit of opinion. Do you think the document is trying to tell you the truth? Why or why not? What are the motivations for which the person who's speaking in the document might have lied to you? Or could they be telling you the truth so far as they know it, but the truth is actually somewhat different? So we're going to do that in class with the Passion of St. Perpetua and Felicity to get it under your belt so that you can get used to applying it to the documents that we read this semester. One last little thing, which is this picture of something called a reliquary. People who died for the faith, martyrs, were also called saints. And people kept little mementos of saints as a way of remembering them, but also because it was believed that there was religious power inside of things that saints left behind. The word relic, R-E-L-I-C, is a term for those things that are left behind a saint. That can be one of the saint's possessions. It can be part of the saint's own body. There can be a bone or a lock of hair, a piece of clothing, all sorts of things like that. And relics become very important in Christianity as a way for regular people to access God's power through objects. We'll talk more about that as we go along in the class. Okay, that's it for now. I will see you all in class, and I hope that we'll have a good discussion.